Basically, I'm going to be reading, going through these notes. I've decided that the easiest thing to do is to just send you guys my notes in full, because ultimately what I'm going to do is use these notes and I'm going to publish, on the church history website, an expanded version of the paper that's been on there since 2005. So anyway, we're really covering the end of the first, beginning of the second century, really into the third century is where we're going to stop. And it's unfortunate that you can't cover it on the century mark, but you'll see why. So we talked a lot last week about the spread of the documents and the rationale behind why they weren't spreading as quickly as we might like. And we're going to get some more evidence to that effect today. So, and in the notes, I'm also trying to give you guys links to the material that I'm using, and these are scholarly works that you can find on Google Books. Now, I will warn you, you never get the whole work, which is unfortunate, but the authors don't want them, they want you to buy it. So I glean as much as I can from Google Books, and then every now and then I'll buy one, but I try not to buy it. But anyway. Okay, so we're going to cover some documents, and I know we mentioned these last week, but I want to go into some detail about their usage, these early documents that do not make it into the New Testament, and their usage of what we call the New Testament documents or inspired scripture. So, First Clement's a document written by the Bishop of Rome in the 90s. He's writing to the church in Corinth. This letter actually has importance because it's one of the first mentions of bishops in the early church. Paul mentions bishops in the pastoral epistles, but we have Clement, who's a bishop in Rome. He's writing the church in Corinth, and he's rebuking them because they kicked their bishop out. And Clement's basically saying, you can't do that. God institutes the bishops, not man. And it's an early witness to what we call Episcopalian government in early Christianity. And again, I'm going to make the point that as Protestants, we want to blame a lot of things on the Catholics that happened long before the Roman Catholic Church, and bishops would be one of them. And the idea that they're supposed to serve for life, or until they really do something, Yes?
Why did they kick him out?
Why? We don't know. But it's apparently for not they don't even have the use of mortal and venial sins yet. That comes about with Tertullian at the about 218 mark. This is in the 90s, but it would be for something like adultery, apostasy.
Character. A character.
Well, character only if it's adultery or fornication or apostasy. During a time of persecution, a bishop hands over inspired texts. They would probably kick him out for that. And so apparently they kicked him out for, who knows? We don't know. And it's unfortunate we don't know. But so here's the important thing for the references of New Testament and the canon. Clement references the Old Testament as scripture and inspired. He alludes to the sayings of Jesus and to various letters of Paul, but he's not really clear that they're scripture. One specific example, and I give you one of many, and you can see it there, where he's basically citing sayings of Jesus, and if you read it, have mercy that you may receive mercy, forgive that it may be forgiven to you, as you do, so shall it be done to you, as you give, so shall it be given to you, as you judge, so shall you be judged, as you show kindness, so shall kindness be showed to you, with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you. Now, when I read that, it's familiar, right? But there are no New Testament, there's no gospel material like that. Exactly. And it's another example of why we believe that the oral traditions of Jesus are being passed down. But the point being that Clement's biblical text that he quotes is Old Testament. And I think it's really important to make this point. You're going to hear the word alludes to. I don't know how many of you are familiar, and man, I hate to say this on camera, but it is what it is. Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He says a lot of things about early church writings and early church fathers that are not exactly accurate. So you will read some more conservative evangelical scholars say that Clement quotes Jesus or quotes Paul. He doesn't. He alludes. An allusion is when a writer like this puts 2 or 3 words together that we have a witness to in our New Testament, but 2 or 3 words is not a quotation. It might be the person's going from their memory. It may be that it's a saying. I mean, makes sense? And so you're going to hear me say allusion a lot, because allusion is not a quotation. Right? You got it? Okay, good. All right. Clement indicates that the church in Rome and in Corinth have copies of Paul's letters, and he instructs them to read those letters. And then 1 Clement is cited by other early Christian writers as inspired. The reason I'm going through these documents and giving you these details is to help you see that the New Testament has not been, it's not established yet. Because some people refer to these writings as inspired, and these writers, don't always cite what we call inspired at this point, right? Epistle of Barnabas, and I'm giving you the rough dates again on these. Epistle of Barnabas, only a few scholars believe this is written by the Barnabas in the book of Acts. The date range is huge because scholars are very divided on the date. It does appear to be a document written in Egypt, having typical Alexandrian style. Alexandrian style becomes very, very important in Christianity. You'll see why in a little bit, but look at the reason or what scholars have determined is Alexandrian. It's a Hellenized view of and an allegorical usage of the Old Testament texts and a fairly negative view of Jewish temple worship. These are things that you can trace all the way back to Philo the Jew who wrote in Alexandria. Where am I? This writer, Barnabas also cites the Old Testament as scripture, and again only alludes to what we call New Testament texts. The only significant early writers that cite Barnabas as inspired are Clement and Origen, and they just happen to both be from Alexandria. So the point being that they probably liked the letter of Barnabas because Barnabas goes along their philosophical views of everything else. Didache. Now Didache has could be an earlier date than Clement or Barnabas. And again, it's, we just don't know the exact dates of these things. But this is also a document with a wide range. This is an early minister's manual with practical guidance on how to conduct things like the Eucharist and water baptism. It's a very interesting document. I've had a couple of you read the Didache. You read the Didache, yeah. It's a very interesting document. And most people who read the Didache for the first time tell me, well, it sounds a lot like Scripture to me. Indeed, it does. Didache reflects an early Jewish Christian orientation, contains the 2 ways teaching, the way of life and the way of death. It's an extension of when Moses delivers the law in the Old Testament, and the 2 ways teaching appears in Barnabas that we just referenced and in the war scrolls of the Essenes in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's a very Jewish oriented presentation that gets adapted into early Christianity, at least as witnessed by the Didache and Barnabas.
I want to ask the question.
Okay.
What happened to the Essenes?
That's a great question.
They don't know.
I don't know. I wouldn't say nobody does, but I don't
Okay.
know. I think, I can give you my sense is that, we believe John the Baptist came from the Essenic group, and we think that Jesus was connected with them, if not any other way but through John the Baptist, has a lot in common with the Essenes. And a lot of scholars think that a significant number of Essenes would have become Christians, would have accepted Jesus as the Messiah. But we don't know. And I honestly, I don't know. Do you know anything about that? Okay.
Do you think this is, them living like they did, do you think that was like the monks lived together? That's reminded me of that.
Absolutely. It
Do you
was.
think that maybe is the first time that kind of thing happened?
I don't know. I don't know that either, but I can tell you that the Essenes are in the Palestinian desert, and at the same time, Philo in Alexandria, Egypt, writes about another group called the Therapeutae that did the same thing the Essenes did. They lived in a commune set up. Now, the difficulty with it is that, there aren't any hard, fast things about. They're mainly men, but they have archaeological finds of graves with women and children together.
That
So
was my next question.
there's a likelihood that they weren't completely
Celibate.
celibate. Thank you.
Weren't they involved in the Battle of Masada?
And that was the other thing I wasn't sure of, so I didn't say it.
Yeah, I think Masada wiped them out.
Oh, really?
That would be the Bar Kokhba revolt. Yeah, because that would have been, if they didn't accept Christ, they were, as you might think when I referenced the war scrolls, they believed that Messiah was coming and then it was going to be war. I mean, that's what they anticipated. Messiah was going to come with blazing fire and he was going to thrash his enemies. And so if they didn't accept Jesus, they might very well have kind of almost in desperation followed the Kokhbas into battle, which did not end well, but nonetheless. So that's another possibility. So the Didache gives an early representation of Trinitarian formula, which is interesting. And now look, I'm telling you so many things that most people, I mean, if you went and told some of your more conservative friends, they would want to kick me out and tell me I'm Catholic because of some of the things I'm putting in here. But it's the state of scholarship. One of the main scholars that I've read on Didache does an ample job of showing that Didache quotes an early version of Matthew's gospel, something that we do not have. It's close enough to Matthew that they believe it was an early version of Matthew, but it's different enough that the scholar illustrates that it must have been earlier. And so we call it M, or Proto-Matthew. And Didache is cited by several early writers as inspired as well. I just find that to be interesting, that it's based on an early version of Matthew. And this again harkens back to last week when we talked about how the Gospels developed. The Gospel tradition was a development as well. As much as we might like it to have been God dropped our Bible from heaven and it was perfect when it landed, it's not that easy. Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch is interesting. He's the bishop of Syria. He's taken prison by the Romans during a brief persecution. He's been hauled to Rome to stand trial where it's believed he was executed. Along the way, he writes 7 letters to different churches. I've listed them there. He's writing on the go, so he doesn't have any documents with him, and he apparently is quoting gospel material and Pauline material from memory. Now, I read a scholar earlier this week who believes that Ignatius also is citing an earlier type version of Matthew, but it is really clear if you read the letters of Ignatius that he knows John's gospel. He claims to have been associated with John somewhere, or maybe Papias claimed that. I'm not remembering, but he makes references that are clearly John's gospel. So. And the letters of Ignatius are cited by several early writers as inspired and gained a significant following because he was martyred. In the early church, if you were martyred, it was the beginning of what becomes saints. We don't have time to go into it, but it is very interesting. Shepherd of Hermas is another interesting document written by someone in Rome. The claim seems to be made that Clement of Rome is the author, but that's highly unlikely. The Shepherd is an allegorical and apocalyptic document, very similar to the Revelation of John. The principal message of the document is urging Christians to live a holy life while offering them the hope of second repentance. I can't go into second repentance, but it's just the idea that if you fail if you have a moral failure after your baptism, that you can still be forgiven. And if you go, well, really? That was an issue in the early church. And there are several documents that reference it, and it was very contentious, a very contentious issue. The Shepherd of Hermas is one of the most popular writings in the early church that doesn't make it into the New Testament. It's just cited by a lot of writers. It's held in high esteem, and you'll see why later on. It's in one of the first canon listings of documents, albeit it's not included in the ones that are official, but it is listed. The only writer that didn't like it, apparently, is Tertullian, and he hated it. He called it the Shepherd of Adulterers instead of the Shepherd of Hermas.
So what didn't he like about it?
He doesn't like the idea that if you commit apostasy, adultery, fornication, or murder after having been water baptized, that you could still be forgiven. Tertullian didn't like the shepherd's whole premise. And Tertullian doesn't deny you can be forgiven, but he basically maintains that no one can tell you you can be. Only God, only the Spirit of God can let you know you're forgiven. But Tertullian did not like the shepherd. And here's the other interesting thing about the Shepherd of Hermas. No citations from either Old or New Testament, which is very unusual. He does make allusions to John's Gospel and seems to be familiar with Paul's Ephesians, and he seems to be very familiar with the letter of James. And James, we're going to find, is a very interesting document in the flow of the canon as well. So these early documents are important evidence of the development of the canon, because we see early on a heavy use of Old Testament and only allusions to what we call New Testament. And as we move into the 2nd century, the allusions to the New Testament become more clear, more often, until it becomes fairly clear that they know New Testament, what we call New Testament documents. But it's the movement from the Jewish text only to what we call the New Testament. And it also reflects oral tradition and the slow circulation of documents. Again, the slow circulation, because these documents, when I first started my doctoral work, that's one of the first things I was asked to do, is familiarize myself with what we call the Apostolic Fathers. And I'd never read them. And on my first reading, the thing that astonished me was, why aren't they quoting the New Testament? They made allusions, but no quotations. And so I found myself thinking, that's odd to me. Well, it's part of why scholars believe they didn't have the New Testament like we would think. One guy Clement obviously has Paul's letter to the Romans and the Corinthians, because he references those two letters. And he says that the Corinthians have the letter from Paul. But that's it, apparently. So, okay, moving right along. The first listing of the New Testament, interestingly enough, is by a man named Marcion, who is deemed a heretic in the 140s. His father, if I'm not mistaken, his father was either a deacon or a presbyter. I think he was he was a presbyter in Rome, but Marcion kind of goes off the rails, and he's labeled as a heretic. He constructs his own Bible. He throws out Matthew, Mark, and John. He'll only accept Luke, and he edits out parts of Luke that he doesn't like. He will only accept Paul's writings, And he rejects the pastorals because in the pastorals, Paul says positive things about the Old Testament. And Marcion hated the Old Testament. He fell into an early form of Gnosticism that taught that the God of the Old Testament was the demiurge. Have you guys heard that expression, demiurge? It's a philosophical category that Plato and other philosophers developed, that the world was created by a lesser God and that he was evil, and that the world is evil, that the physical reality itself is evil. Well, we don't accept that. I mean, the Judeo-Christian philosophy has never accepted that. I mean, we just learned about the creation, that it was good. So that's why Marcion was labeled a heretic. Interestingly enough, he becomes a successful evangelist. His church grows all around the empire, especially in North Africa and Italy, and he continues into the 5th century, his churches. But he presents a list, and it's the first known list of a canon. Now, you know the word canon means rule, R-U-L-E. It's the rule that we follow. And so the canon is like the rule of what books we follow. And so Marcion puts this canon forward, and it pushes the early church to develop a canon. It's kind of like, oh my goodness, he's cut out 3 of our Gospels, and he's made a list, so we will not reject these 3, and we're going to keep the 4 and that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons Marcion is so important. He's denounced by several early fathers, and indeed Tertullian writes a treatise against Marcion. That's how important this guy was. So Tertullian, writing 80 years after Marcion's time, writes a treatise against him, arguing philosophically against and biblically against Marcion. That brings us to the 2nd century apologists. These guys are important because some of the clearest evidence against Gnosticism, because remember, Marcion is a brand of Gnosticism or Gnostic thought, and we're going to find out Gnosticism also plays a significant role in the development of the New Testament. So these apologists, one of their biggest objectives is to write against Gnosticism. So as they write against Gnosticism, parenthetically, they tell us things about the development of the New Testament. And so that's what we're going to look at. Justin Martyr, he doesn't cite any New Testament writings by name, but he does designate several New Testament citations and allusions with words like "it is recorded" or "the memoirs of the apostles." He says things that let you know that he is quoting or citing what we would call New Testament writings, even though he doesn't name them by name. And then I put a very important citation from Justin Martyr in his first apology. "For the apostles in the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, have thus delivered unto us what was enjoined upon them, that Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, said, 'This do in remembrance of me.'" Does anybody remember from last week? "This do in remembrance of me," the importance of that phrase does not occur in Mark or Matthew, only occurs in Paul and in Luke. And yet Justin Martyr references that. So I think that's interesting. Little tidbit. But he never cites any Pauline writing, which I find interesting. However, he writes against Marcion. If he writes against Marcion, he has to know that Marcion only accepted Paul. So we think Justin Martyr surely knew of Paul's writings, but he never quotes him, never cites him. But interestingly enough, one of his disciples, Tatian, creates a harmony of the 4 Gospels. So he takes papyrus, and he lays out the 4 Gospels in 4 columns: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. and he tries to do it in a chronology. So if you guys ever have a Bible, in the back of your Bible, have you ever seen that where people try to line up the four Gospels and try to make Tatian did that. He lays the foundation for that. In fact, and it's called the Diatessaron, and that document, the Diatessaron, was actually accepted as the authentic gospel material for maybe 100 years in some of the regions. It eventually fell off to the side because it was too complicated. Because you cannot have a perfect chronological record of the four Gospels. It's impossible. And so it became complicated for the average bishop. I can't make sense of this. But anyway, it does confirm that the church believed in only four Gospels. So let me just underscore this. So Justin Martyr quotes all four Gospels, or not quotes, but it cites from or alludes to all four. And then his disciple Tatian develops this harmony of the four Gospels in the 170 time frame. That brings us to Irenaeus. Irenaeus confirms the four Gospels, and I put the quote right there that the Word gave us the fourfold gospel, fourfold form, held together by one Spirit. Now, Irenaeus brings us to a new stage in the development of the New Testament because he's the first Christian writer who cites clearly from almost all the New Testament that we have, and he does it all the time. I mean, he wrote Against the Heresies. It's a major treatise, fairly lengthy, and has tons of citations from New Testament documents. You can see more than 25 occurrences from Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians. He also includes citations or allusions from the pastoral epistles. He doesn't really cite those smaller writings that Philemon, 2 Peter, 3 John, and Jude. But the problem with the Irenaeus, as far as New Testament is concerned, he also cites some of these documents as inspired. So again, we're looking at this dynamic movement of what is the New Testament. It's still moving around at this point, obviously. So the evidence we get from Irenaeus is that the Gospels are beginning to circulate, and he wants to make sure that the church only embraces the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, we've already mentioned the Gospel of Thomas, which is an early collection of sayings that contain both orthodox and dubious things. And we know from references made by Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria that there are other questionable Gospels. And Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria name these. Okay? So you can see some of, to be honest with you, I just pulled these out off the top of my head. The Gospel of Truth, the Gospel to the Hebrews, the Gospel to the Egyptians, the Gospel of Philip, and there are a bunch of others. I'm going to read a list in a little bit. Now, we know Luke mentioned that there were other people who were making attempts when he wrote his Gospel. And what we think is happening is these writers are trying to warn Christians, don't read these writings. And so we have four Gospels. Well, the reason they would say four is they know all these other ones, and they're trying to let everybody know we only have four. These are the four that we affirm, not these other ones. So that brings us to Clement of Alexandria.
So the term gospel that was used then as meaning what?
Stories of and sayings of Jesus.
Okay.
All right, where do we get that definition of gospel as good news?
New Testament, the Evangelion, the good news.
Okay.
But writers, what happened is, we think, is that you get the original gospel writers, and then you get Johnny come lately. some guy like Marcion who decides he's got a better way figured out. And so I'm not saying Marcion did this, but I'm using him because we just talked about Marcion. And so Marcion decides, you know what, I think I'll write my own gospel, because I don't like these guys. I have a difference of opinion. And so I can't get into the minds of these people. I just know that there are tons of gospels floating around, and I'm going to read you a list in a minute.
And were these written during the time of Christ or shortly after?
No, good question. No, these Gnostic gospels are mostly written, we think, in the middle of the 2nd century through the probably end of the 3rd century. It's hard to date. They're not all easily dated. But Irenaeus gives us this, Irenaeus against the heresies. For a long time, scholars did not believe Irenaeus. He names some of these gospels. He tells us crazy things that they did. They had crazy sexual practices, and a lot of liberal scholars were just, this is ridiculous. He's saying this stuff because they're flexing the church's muscles to gain power over the common people. And then we found the Nag Hammadi texts that had writings the same name on them as what Irenaeus told us, and described some bizarre things that Irenaeus told us. And so Irenaeus was vindicated. And that happens over and over in archaeological finds. They attack Christian writers for exaggerating or not telling the truth, and then somebody digs up some document that vindicates them. And of course, what I always argued was, Christian writers don't lie. That's part of who we are. They might make mistakes. They might present only their evidence. They might not tell you the bad evidence that disagrees with them, but they're not going to lie. And the liberal scholars have it in their heads that these guys are just wanting political and economic power and that they'll do anything for it. Well, that's been proven over and over again not to be true. So anyway, Clement of Alexandria, I was just going to say, you were asking me when they were written. We have Irenaeus writing against the heretics, and he names them. And then when we get to Clement of Alexandria, who is 20 to 25 years after Irenaeus, we get the feeling. And Clement of Alexandria is the first significant Christian writer out of Egypt that we know. And so because of Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, what we believe is that the Gnostic movement grew out of, you were asked me earlier, where did these Gnostics come from? We believe it was a slow growth that had its kind of center of gravity somewhere around the Egyptian area. Because that's where we get a lot of this stuff happening, these documents. And again, Clement of Alexandria is important because he writes against these guys a lot and names their writings.
And wasn't Paul, encountering some of this too and having to teach against it?
Well, what we would say is that this is what Paul encounters, and even John's gospel in his first, what we call 1 John is written for early, we would call it pre-Gnostics. It has signs of Gnosticism, but in the scholarly view, Gnosticism doesn't really take full bloom until the middle of the 2nd century. So what you get prior to that, even Marcion it's hard to call him a Gnostic. He has a lot of Gnostic ideas and tendencies, but because of what happens, because of full-blown Gnosticism, you don't want to call Marcion an all-out Gnostic because he's nowhere near as bizarre as what we're going to encounter in the Gospel to the Egyptians. You remember in our church history class. It's bizarre, and we're going to look at that briefly. But Clement is important because he's arguing against the Gnostics, yet he seems to hold some Gnostic ideas. He cites, and here's a very important thing, he only cites the 4 orthodox gospels that we've just seen. And so here we are in the early 200s, and Clement of Alexandria is basically saying he's only quoting Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as inspired. Now he does, and he argues against these other gospels. Now, don't you hate it when I do this? But then from time to time, he will reference a non-orthodox gospel in a seemingly positive way. Clement's a very unique Christian writer because he argues against Gnosticism, and then every now and then he'll say something and you'll go, wait a minute. So he's kind of funny. Clement's not exactly clear sometimes, but he quotes the Apostle Paul over 1,200 times as scripture or inspired, and his citations of Paul are pretty much word for word what we read in our New Testament. So it's another very important step in the development of the New Testament. We get over 1,200 quotations from Paul, which is, he's the first writer to do that in the clear way that he does. In other words, these aren't allusions, these are citations. Of 1, 2, 3 verses back, boom, a passage. Okay, we're not including Tertullian as a 2nd century apologist, but like Clement, he represents a clear change in Christian writers with respect to the New Testament documents. He clearly cites New Testament texts hundreds of times. The Gospels, Pauline, general writings, you name it. If we took Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, so these two guys, I didn't write Tertullian up there. Sorry, Tertullian, I didn't write you up there. It's funny, Tertullian's not considered an apologist, even though he does write apologetics. He's not lumped in the 2nd century because he's too far into the 3rd century. So we call the 2nd century apologists these three, and then Tertullian kind of takes us into the 3rd century. Did I just say 3rd century for these guys, or did I say 2nd? Okay. I might have mixed it. But anyway, it's just important because we could take Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian and we could reconstruct a huge percentage of the New Testament from their quotations. Early in my Christian life, I was told that the early Christian writers changed the New Testament. I was told that by a liberal man who didn't like my exuberant faith. And it really knocked the wind out of my sails. So I was a freshman. So I went to the library and I started pulling down early Christian writers, and I started reading Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian, and I remember vividly, I can see it in my mind, sitting at this big table in the library reading Tertullian, and I'm thinking, he just quoted 1 Corinthians, and he quoted it exactly as I read it. And I read enough that I just decided, you know what, if they changed it, it must have been before these guys. And these are, Clement's the end of the... And indeed, what he was trying to portray is that the New Testament had not, as we're talking about, had not become fixed. And we don't get clear citations, but it's not because it changed, it's because it was... We don't know what these guys had. We don't know what documents they had. Okay. The only thing about Clement and Tertullian that's important, other than what I just told you, is that the New Testament writings that are mostly ignored by both of these writers is the letter of James, Philemon, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John. But from this point forward, an important question that will be asked when people ask, what are the documents that we affirm? The important question is, did Clement of Alexandria or Tertullian cite from that document? Because if they didn't, then we're going to hold it at arm's length. If they did, if they quoted it as scripture, then that's a feather in the cap of that writing. But these are the first prolific Christian writers, Clement and Tertullian. I mean, they have a big corpus, both of them. of writings. Tertullian writes a bunch more individual writings. Clement is actually only known for 3 major writings, and there is a 4th and maybe even a 5th, but those 3 are big. Tertullian writes, gosh, I don't know, 15 or 20, maybe 25 different treatises, but they're all smaller, shorter in nature.
So were these guys schooled, or what was their background?
Good question. Tertullian was trained as a lawyer and then becomes a Christian. Clement is trained as a philosopher, and his testimony is that he early on becomes a Christian in his philosophical training. So yeah, I argue against one particular, he's not really a scholar, but a writer, who says that he uses these early Christian writers as the norm. Well, they're not the norm. Most Christians can't read. These are the most educated men. They're the highest educated men of the day. And they're writing, if you read Tertullian, he's known to be like a lawyer. He tears his opponent to shreds. And Clement does too. Clement uses more nice philosophical musings, but so yeah, these guys are highly educated. Yeah. All right, the Muratorian Canon. This is one of the most significant historical points in our journey. So far, what we've been doing is we've been gleaning from writings of early Christians. This is an actual list. It's the oldest known, quote, orthodox list of the New Testament. It's a Latin manuscript copied from Greek. It's missing the beginning and the end, and as much as you hate it, a lot of these early documents have problems. They have holes. The earliest document we have of many of our documents, have deteriorated over time, and they have holes in them. Where they're missing words or missing pages or whatever. I told you the story last week about the Nag Hammadi texts that were burned to start an oven. That's the kind of stuff that happens. We believe that this document is written around 170 to 200. You can see that, discovered by a famous historian named, I can't pronounce his name, but his last name is Muratori. Interestingly enough, he was not searching for the New Testament canon. He was writing and doing research on the poor quality of medieval scribes in their copying of documents. That's what he was chasing, were documents to prove that the medieval scribes had not done as well as earlier scribes, in their transmission of manuscripts. And in the process, he finds this document. And I have tried my best to kind of lay out the document. You can read it if you follow some of the links I've given you, earlychristianwritings.com. And then there was another link I gave you. You can read the document that we call the Muratorian Canon. You can read the translation of it. It's very easy. But so the beginning of the document is missing. So where we get the start of the document, he mentions Luke and John's Gospels. But he also mentions that there were 4 Gospels, so we assume that he had mentioned Matthew and Mark, but it's missing. The first part of the document's missing. He mentions the book of Acts. He mentions Pauline letters. He also says, and I'm quoting from the actual document, there is current also an epistle to the Laodiceans, another to the Alexandrians, forged in Paul's name for the sect of Marcion. So the letter to the Alexandrians was known by whoever wrote this document as a forgery. But the letter to the Laodiceans is a document that we actually have to this day. Scholars don't believe Paul really wrote it, but it was a known writing. And several others which cannot be received, and then he names He doesn't name 1st and 2nd John, but he says that there are 2 letters from John, the same John that wrote the Revelation. And then he mentions Jude, then he mentions Revelation. What he doesn't list in this document, whoever he is, and I'm saying he, I mean, the writer, omits Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 3rd John. And at the end of the document, he tacks on the wisdom of Solomon, the Apocalypse of Peter, and Shepherd of Hermas. The one that I said was one of the most popular documents, the Shepherd of Hermas. So by the end of the 2nd century, most of the 27 documents that we hold as the New Testament canon have already gained widespread acceptance, especially the 4 Gospels and Paul's writings. It's critical to understand why only 4 Gospels, and I don't need to go through that. I mean, just the idea of Marcion and the Gnostic Gospels, the writers wanted it to be clear that these are these 4 and no more. Gnosticism. I don't want to go through this line by line, but Gnostics presented another problem, and I think we referenced this last week. You know, didn't I tell you guys that the Gnostics would latch on to a writing that was accepted as inspired, and the church would be like, oh man, you know, we don't know if we want to, we might need to keep arm's length from this document because the Gnostics have a copy of it, and the Gnostics were famous for changing stuff, going into a document, making a copy and adding stuff, and then they propagate their copy, and so the church is in a quandary. What do? I mean, we've got Mark's gospel, they've got Mark's gospel, but they've added some bogus stuff to it. And so what are we going to do? Maybe we should just reject Mark's gospel altogether. Just, you know, they've messed it up, we'll just give it to them.
So fake news has been around since the beginning of
There
time.
you go, good. Fake news. That's good.
The Russians did.
Okay. Now, skip down to, I want to read at the bottom of page 7. One can give some explanation for the strange Gnostic passages, but even with the proper historian, I mean, I've discussed Gnosticism with several non-Christian scholars in my field who think the Gnostic writings are great and fascinating, and they act like the New Testament documents are bizarre. But here's the critical difference between the New Testament and the Gnostic writings. The basic message in the New Testament is powerful because it's profound. It takes something complicated. The creator of all the universes somehow has given us the ability to have forgiveness and reconciliation, and it does it in a very simple way. The Gnostic texts are just, it's like everything's complicated. It's hard to figure out what the writer's trying to say. I mean, you'd have to spend a lifetime studying it, and every Gnostic text is different. I mean, our New Testament there's some real continuity that flows through our documents, right? You know, Jesus is the Son of God. There isn't a document in there that says he's not. You know, Jesus is raised from the dead. There's not a document that disputes that in our set of documents. Well, the Gnostic text, one is different from the next, and you don't know. One's using one crazy angelic name, and the other one's using a different one as the chief source of knowledge. It's just bizarre. I don't know. Anyone who watches this and knows Gnosticism better than me will, I mean, I'm not an expert on Gnostic texts, but I've read many of them, but I just find them bizarre and complicated. So, what am I? Top of page 8. The Gospel of Thomas, I just want to point this out. I forever am amused by scholars who quote the most non-bizarre passages from the Gnostic texts and don't tell you the bizarre ones, like saying 7. Blessed is the lion which the man shall eat, and the lion become a man. And cursed is the man whom the lion shall eat, and the lion become a man. I mean, I don't know.
That sounds pretty literal.
They were smoking something.
Yeah,
saying
they had good weed back in the desert.
saying 114, let Mary go forth from among us, for women are not worthy of the life. Jesus said, behold, I shall lead her, that I may make her male, in order that she may also become a living spirit like you males. For every woman who makes herself male shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. You would think that that text would become very popular in today's world that we live in, you know? But the liberal scholars hate, see, they like to hold up the Gnostic text as being, they like to hold the New Testament up and Paul as anti-woman. And they hold the Gnostic text up as this very embracing, you know, we accept everybody. But they never will read that text. That the woman shall become like a male. Whatever. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm being very, anyway, I'm sorry. Okay. But look at the gospel of the Egyptians for those who didn't take our early Christianity. I mean, this is such a, and I love to give this example, and I will admit readily the gospel of the Egyptians is the most bizarre Gnostic writing I've ever read. I've read 8 or 10 Gnostic writings, you know, start to finish, because I had to. I mean, I felt like my brain was jello by the end. But anyway, but the Gospel of the Egyptians is the most bizarre. And I'm going to look at this. Look at, I mean, this, I've photocopied this out of the Nag Hammadi Library in English because I wanted you to see it. But look at, let's say, start reading it, I don't know, right above verse 15. The Father of the great light, who came forth from the silence. He is the great Doxamadon Eon, in which the thrice male child rests. And the throne of his glory was established in it. This one on which his unrevealable name is inscribed on the tablet. One is the Word, the Father of the light of everything. He who came forth from silence, while he rests in the silence. He whose name is an invisible symbol. A hidden, invisible mystery came forth. I mean, and you are supposed to sound out these strings of vowels. And the whole document's like that. It's just, well, I mean, did anybody, I mean, come on. I don't know. I'm guilty of being jaded against the Gnostics. I
So
will
they were
admit
trying to do
that.
the vowels, A-E-I-O-U, and sometimes Y.
Okay. All right. So the point being that the New Testament, the early church writers felt it very important that the Christians know these documents are what we ascribe to, and these we reject. And you just got a good example of why. They're bizarre. They're not Christian. By 220 in the close of the writings of Tertullian, we're beginning to see many citations from the documents that we have in our New Testament. Some of the smaller works are noticeably absent, but to some degree, this is due to the size and nature of the writings. It's far more likely that Tertullian or Clement are going to quote from Romans than they are 2 John. Romans has 433. Is this in your notes? Okay, good. I couldn't remember where I added. Romans has 433 verses, and it's full of important theological, doctrinal concepts. 2 John has 8 verses. Okay, it has 13, but 5 of the verses are hello and goodbye. It only has 8 verses. So, and the smaller writings are like that. Now, I will tell you that we don't have all of Tertullian's writings. A lot of his writings we don't have. Some of Clement's writings we don't have. Some of Origen's, we're about to read Origen. If we had all of Tertullian's writings, I would bet you that he quotes from 2nd and 3rd John. I would be willing to bet that. But we don't have all his writings. Now, we're going to cover the beginning of the 3rd century and Origen. He is so important for many, many reasons, but for the New Testament, we're going to find out. So the next significant Christian father and writer is Origen. He's different from the previous writings. His father was martyred when he was a teenager. Why is that significant? Because he was a teenager, and he was already a Christian, a very devout Christian. But his father being martyred as any of us would imagine, made an indelible mark on his soul. And he devoted himself to the kingdom of God. From that moment forward, he took a vow. We don't know that there weren't vows of celibacy at this time, but he never married, never did anything with women. I mean, he was like the first monk. And his writings are huge. He wrote, and I'll just read it because I don't want to leave anything out. Origen's body of work is huge. Sermons, treatises on topics like Tertullian had done. Well, let me just read you the prior paragraph. Prior to Origen, Tertullian was the most prolific writer, but most of his writings are to attack what he perceives as unorthodox teachings. We know of about 50 of his writings, but we only have 31. Most of his works are titled against something. He's writing against, as a lawyer would. He's attacking people's beliefs, and he does that even when he writes on repentance, on baptism, on prayer. Origen's work is different. He's the first Christian writer who writes commentaries, and he wrote a commentary on every book of what we know of as the Bible. Origen is trained in the philosophical school in Alexandria. He's trained in theology. He's trained in rhetoric. He's trained in
How do you spell his name?
philosophy. Who? Origen?
O-R-I-G-N.
Yeah. Origen. I'm sorry, I just
We don't
realized.
have these names.
Yeah, these are the notes I added. I
Your
apologize.
big head was in there.
Okay. What I decided was that we needed to end on Origen, and I needed to cover him before we finish this class. So I apologize, but it'll be in the new notes that you'll be able to download.
So
But-
commentary for every book, Old Testament and New Testament?
Yes. He writes a commentary on, well, I say every book. We don't have a lot of these, but we think he wrote a commentary on every book of the Old and New Testaments. He wrote hundreds of letters, and his letters were in a collection that we think burned in a fire of a monastery.
As I'm writing,
So
and then I have to say we think.
So we lost all of his letters, which we probably would have gained a lot of
But
insight.
they were referenced.
Yes, we have references to them, but we don't have enough quotations to know much. He was formally educated in the Greek classics, philosophy, grammar, and he got together with Jewish scribes and taught himself Hebrew. Through their help, taught himself Hebrew, translated the entire Old Testament into Greek. Now, he had the Septuagint, but that wasn't enough for Origen. He perceived that it wasn't as good a translation, so he took it upon himself to translate it. I think it's called the Hexpla. I can't remember, but his commentary, get this, his commentary on John's Gospel was huge. I mean, this gives you an example of what we know of Origen. We only have 32 books of it. We think there were 10 or 15 more to finish John's Gospel. Now, I don't know how big the books are, okay? I've never read Origen. I haven't read very much of Origen. But I don't know how big it is, but a book is probably similar to a chapter of our Bible. I don't know. It just depends. It depends on the author. But his works are enormous, usually. Given all of his, I should read, that's what I should do. Given all of this, the fact that he wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible, and then he wrote a bunch of treatises, his biblical quotations are in the multiplied thousands. I mean, thousands and thousands of quotations from Old and New Testament. Yet scholars see small differences in his citations from one work to the next. From his quotation of a verse in a commentary like on John's Gospel, he might quote a verse in one book, and then 10 books later he'll quote the verse again and it'll be slightly different. And scholars have determined that he's quoting all the text from memory. The dude knew the Bible, and he quotes it from memory. He writes such a voluminous amount of writing that people think that he basically just sat and wrote all day, every day. Well, if you write like that, the way the Bible was compiled in those days, he can't look up chapter and verse. There are no chapter and verse. And so scholars think he's just quoting from memory. So his quotations are not exact all the time. But I don't know about you, but I find that pretty amazing. Our purpose here is to show this. Everything I just told you about Origen, he's the first Christian writer to clearly quote from the letter of James. Why do I bring that up? Because as I was doing my research for this class, I found myself not worried about 2nd and 3rd John, or, the smaller writings, Philemon. I wasn't worried about those, but I kept thinking James. James is a significant writing. It's 5 chapters. He's the brother of Jesus. Why would he not appear in any of these guys? And so I spent a few hours digging through to find out. Origen's the first one. Now, there are many early traditions about James, the brother of Jesus, so it's strange that the letter attributed to him is not openly cited until the 230s. Even Origen's citation of James comes with the comment, and I'm quoting, "the epistle of James that is in circulation." And that's all. That's all. Possibly indicating that some people didn't consider it authentic. This is what I think. And I found a scholar who said this, and I already was thinking this, and I just think this is it. Another possible reason James is absent from the earlier writings is that there are there's 4 writings that we know of that were circulating that were Gnostic writings, or at least non-orthodox. And I'm going to name them: the Apocryphon of James, the Secret Book of James, the Second Apocalypse of James, the Infancy Gospel of James, and the I can't even say it, but it's the Proto-Gospel of James. And so some scholars believe that the church fathers stayed away from quoting James because his name was associated with dubious documents. And so the church, this is another evidence for what I told you earlier, the church just was like, if we quote from James, someone might think we're quoting from the Apocalypse of James or whatever. I don't know. But it's interesting that Origen's the first Christian writer.
Well, and they probably question the validity of all of them.
Yes.
And
that was
including
your
James.
good comment, and that's exactly right. And that's why James is one of the last books that we think comes into full agreement that it should be in the New Testament, and it's because of that. It's just scary for them. They got all these other James in things with his name on it.
Those that you mentioned.
And the letter of James doesn't reference Jesus very openly. I think 2 references to Jesus. So
This, I know, I told you the other day, I wish James had talked about it.
what, his brother-in-law?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shared a little more insight to the sibling. But my question is, have you read any of those other documents? Or
I haven't read the James ones. But I've read numerous. I'll tell you when we get. So I'm going to close our discussion by saying this, that in Origen we clearly see that the early church takes the Old Testament as inspired. Look, Origen makes it very clear. He dedicates a chunk of his life to learn Hebrew, to translate the Old Testament into Greek, to write commentaries on every last book. He is not at all negative. You know how I've told you, I've referenced some of these guys are negative towards, they have the Alexandrian view. Origen is Alexandrian, but he doesn't share that. Well, he shares some. He likes to interpret things allegorically. So he'll interpret Old Testament stuff allegorically that you and I would read and go, why not just take it literally? It seems pretty clear that a literal reading of it is okay, but he makes it allegorical, which is an Alexandrian trait. But my point is, with Origen, we get the very clear representation that the church is saying the Old Testament is ours. In fact, that was the other thing about Origen. He wanted to have his own translation because he wanted it to be ours. He wanted to own it. I want this. I want the Old Testament, not as the Jewish Bible. It's our Bible. It's my Bible. Or he probably didn't say Bible. As my sacred text, along with the writings of the apostles. When it comes to the New Testament, we have to keep in mind, if we had all of Origen's writings, he probably cited, like I said about Tertullian, Origen most certainly would have cited 2 Peter and 2 and 3 John, but there are no references in any of the writings that we have of Origen of 2 Peter or 2 and 3 John, which is another reason those documents were late comers into the New Testament. They were the last of the books to have enough agreement among bishops that they accepted. Yeah.
Origen's Alexandria. The writer of Hebrews was apparently Alexandria. Did Origen quote Hebrews any? I would think he'd be quoting.
I'm almost positive he did, but to be honest with you caught me out. I can't give you a definitive. I would think he did. I know he did, because it's through Origen that we learn. Because up until Origen, people assumed that Paul wrote Hebrews, and Origen is the one who says nobody knows who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Only God knows. He's famous for saying that.
Is there any? Is it you're making some kind of separation between Alexandrian thought and Hebrew thought? Is there some kind of rule that you can say Hebrews roll this way and?
When you say, wait a minute, are you saying Hebrew as in Jewish Hebrew or
Jewish
Hebrews?
Hebrew, not Hebrew, the book.
Okay.
The people.
Okay.
The Alexandrian philosophy rolls this way. The Hebrew philosophy rolls this way. Is there any kind of
Paradigm?
rule that
Yeah.
you could apply?
Yeah, I don't know, but we talked about this in our church history class.
I wasn't here for that, so please explain.
Starting with Philo the Jew. You remember we have Jews living all over the Roman Empire whose language is Greek. It's part of the reason we have a Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint is the Jews needed the law and the prophets in a language they could understand. If you read Hebrew, they're not going to understand it. And so there was a general feeling that we need the Old Testament in Greek. And that was, translation was done in Alexandria, Egypt. I guess taking advantage of the great library there. Philo the Jew is the leader of the philosophical school. He's a contemporary of Jesus, so 1st century. Philo's biblical text, he's not a Christian. He's before Christianity in a significant way. His biblical text is the Old Testament, but it's the Greek Old Testament. And he reads it differently. He's trained in Platonic philosophy. He reads the Old Testament through a lens of philosophical thought. So he reads the Old Testament in an allegorical fashion. Now, and he's the beginning point for what we call the school of Alexandrian thought in Christianity. Because Clement studies in that school and Origen studies in that school. And you just heard me say, Origen is huge in Christian history because of the volume of writing that he put out. And he's read by, every Christian father from Origen till today If you're trained in theology, you will read Origen at some point in time. And he was a hero among some of the 4th and 5th century writers, and he caused a lot of conflict, his writing. One writing of his in particular, of Origen's, causes a great amount of conflict. I don't want to get into it, but so it's called the Origenist controversy, and it pops its head up every couple hundred years, and people get kicked out of the church for it. He promotes what we would call, he doesn't promote it, but he's writing a document where he's just saying, we're going to, this is for the advanced theological students. Please don't, if you're not advanced, don't read this document. And if you do, please understand we're throwing out ideas to discuss and to expand our minds. Well, what do? We read it and we take it seriously and we pin it on him as if he really is arguing for it. And I don't know if he does or not. I'm not an Origenist scholar, but universalism. Any discussion of universalism, Rob Bell is going to quote Origen in his First Principles. That's the biggie, is universalism. Which leads to the Catholic development of purgatory. The idea that you'll be held in a place where God's going to burn out all of your sinfulness before he lets you into heaven. Well, Origen has a lot to do with that. I was going to say unfortunately, but anyway, I want to read to you really quickly. So I'm done almost, but I want to read to you the titles of the Nag Hammadi texts. Okay, this will go towards your answer. And I'll try to reference as I go the ones that I've read.
Are you going to put this in your notes for next week?
I wasn't planning to,
Well, if you're gonna,
but you can look it up. I mean, I can. It's easy. All you got to do is search Nag Hammadi texts, and you can see it. But
you scholarly student.
I just want to give you an idea of the titles of some of the works that are circulating that are giving the Christian writers grief. Okay? And if you could, it's hard for us to get our heads into this, but think if we had people coming here and reading a document named The Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles. And they said, well, it says in the Acts of Peter, and they said it, and it was in our church. And it was something that we've never heard, and it represented something that we would think is a little bizarre. Well, that's what they were faced with. So, the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles. Allegens, the foreigner. I don't even know what allegens means. I apologize. The Apocalypse of Adam. Remember, Gnosticism is an amalgamation of Jewish mysticism, Jewish apocalypticism, Christianity, and Platonism, philosophy, and it's all mushed up. If they put it all in a blender and blended it up and popped it out with these documents, that's what it feels like. So consequently, in Gnosticism, the beginning is really important. What happens in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and and the giants and the Nephilim, all that kind of stuff is really important to the Gnostics. They want to know all that stuff. So they write about it. So the Apocalypse of Adam, the first Apocalypse of James, the second Apocalypse of James, the Apocalypse of Paul, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acrophon or secret book of James, the secret book of John. I can't say this. I don't know how to
Wow,
pronounce
that's an
it.
interesting book. I want to hear interesting writing.
And basically, so far, I haven't read any of these that I'm not naming. I'll tell you when I get to authoritative teaching. That sounds like a good one. The book of Thomas the Contender. I've read major portions of that. The concept of our great power. Now, these are translations of the titles, and actually, I think I've read that one from a different title. But anyway, the dialogue of the Savior, the discourse on the 8th and 9th. Eugnastus the Blessed, the exegesis of the soul, the Gospel of the Egyptians. I've read that, or at least major sections. The Gospel of Philip, I've read that, major sections. The Gospel of Thomas, I've read that. The Gospel of Truth. Interestingly, the Gospel of Truth is, generally speaking, a Christian writing. It's not a Gnostic writing. Most of the ones that I've read the titles of are Gnostic. But the Gospel of Truth is pretty much a Christian writing. It's a little bizarre, but it's not Gnostic. I've read that one. The Hypostasis of the Archons. That sounds like a fun book. I can't pronounce.
Sounds like a movie.
I can't pronounce this one, so I'm skipping it. I don't even know how to start pronouncing it. The Interpretation of Knowledge. The letter. Here's an interesting Gnostic writing. The letter of Peter to Philip. I've not read that. Marsanes. I don't know how to say that. Melchizedek. Haven't read that one. I should. I probably will before we teach the letter to the Hebrews, because I'm going to be teaching on Melchizedek. That I can tell you. On the anointing, on baptism, on the Eucharist. No, I didn't read any of those. On the origin of the world, I've read some of that. The paraphrase of Shem. You know, Shem is big in Gnostic circles because Shem is Adam's son that is blessed, right?
Righteous son of Shem, yeah.
Isn't that right?
Shem, Noah's son.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Noah's son.
Yeah,
What did I just say?
Adam.
Yeah,
I didn't pay attention.
Seth is Adam. Shem.
There you go.
Shem.
But isn't Shem isn't he one of the good?
He's the one that the Jewish lineage came through.
Yes. So he's important. So we're going to write, something about him that he said that I guess
Was
is
righteous or
revealed through the heavens. I don't know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be this way about the Gnostic writings. It's,
Their interpretation.
it comes from reading them though. And then Plato's Republic, parts of Plato's Republic is in the Nag-Hammadi.
Interesting.
The prayer,
interesting.
the prayer of the Apostle Paul. Well, yeah, but remember, Gnosticism is an amalgamation of all these things that includes Platonism. Because, Plato represents you remember, Socrates teaches his students, and then after he dies, Plato and Aristotle come into a bit of a conflict.
Yeah.
Aristotle interprets Socrates one way, Plato interprets Socrates in a spiritual way. And they split. And Plato's lineage, well, he studies Plato. He is a Platonist. And although Origen would deny it, he's a Platonist. Philo the Jew is a Platonist. His biblical text is the Old Testament, but you asked me where does Alexandrian school of thought? Starts with Philo. And Philo's a Platonist. And that's why he reads the Old Testament through a lens of philosophical reading. Now, if you read Philo, it's not terrible stuff. I mean, he has a lot of good thoughts about the Old Testament. So I'm not disparaging him. I mean, look, I have some Platonism in me now because I read this guy. The prayer of thanksgiving. I'm trying to get through these. The second treatise of the great Seth. The sentences of Sextus. I'm sorry?
That was like Star Wars
Yes.
or something.
The sentences of Sextus I've read, and it's a Christian writing in the Nag Hammadi library. The Sophia of Jesus Christ. Sophia, anybody? The wisdom of Jesus Christ. I've not read that one. The teachings of Sylvanus. That's a mostly Christian document, and I've read that one, or major parts of that one. The testimony of truth. The thought of Noria. I don't know. The three steles of Seth. The thunder, perfect mind. That's the name of a document. The thunder, perfect mind. The treatise on the resurrection. The trimorphic protonoia, three forms of the first thought. The tripartite tractate, a Valentinian exposition, and Zostrianos. I almost said Nostradamus. So, just the titles can tell you something. Now,
Yeah, they can bruise your tongue.
I'm not urging you to go read I mean, look, I don't believe that, like, if you read one of these documents that you're gonna be, some demon's gonna grab you. I don't believe that. We have the Spirit of God in us. The early church had that belief, though. First of all, most of the people are illiterate, so they can't go read them, but they do not want them hearing this stuff. They don't want them hearing it because in the hands of a charismatic person, they can lead people astray. And Gnosticism flourished. In the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, it was a big time problem for early Christianity. But it's partly why we have a New Testament. The early church had to disavow anything like this and encourage people. These are the documents. And the canon, actually, the beginning point of the canon is these are the documents and the only documents that you're allowed to read on Sunday morning in church. These are fine to read. They always say that. If any Christian wants to read these, we think they're good documents. But it's on Sunday morning, these are the only, and the list, that's where we get the list and the rule. These are the only documents you're to read on Sunday morning. Now, I confess that I've read, what did I read from the Didache, I think, one morning? I can't remember, but I've read from a few non-New Testament writings. I'm guilty. So.
At least it wasn't Rick Warren.
Shots fired.
Okay,
Chris.
so we're done. I had to jam all that in. I didn't leave time for questions. Maybe I should have left Origin out. I added Origin because I didn't think I had enough material.
Oh, I'll get a picture.
Was that a mistake? Well, we're done. So if you have a question, I'll be happy to. You can turn it off. I'll be happy to entertain any questions if you want, but we're done.
My phone